with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
In the search for family ties overseas, understanding here at home. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Tonight on the agenda in the summer, the wit and humor of writer Alison Wearing as she and her father find their way through Ireland. It seems like we spend most of our lives trying to figure out who we are. So it's not surprising that some 26 million of us have taken Ancestry tests. But what if you could actually take a trip in search of that identity? Alison Wearing did just that with her father, and she writes about it with insight and serious humor in Moments of Glad Grace, a memoir. And Alison joins us now from Stratford, Ontario. Welcome.
Thank you.
What a fab book. So great. I was laughing and then I was crying and I was laughing. So it's really nice we get an opportunity to talk about it.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, your father invites you to join him on a trip to Ireland as he is on a quest of sorts. The only other time that you've both traveled together outside the country is in Paris when you were in your teens. But you were kind of reluctant to join him on this trip. Why were you reluctant?
Well, I was thrilled to join him on the trip. I was reluctant to do the genealogical research that he was interested in doing because, well, I fall asleep at the word genealogy, and I wasn't sure that I'd be able to stomach the libraries and archives.
What was your dad in search of?
Specifically was looking for documents that related to 4 families on his mother's side who emigrated from Ireland. And he had very specific he'd done a lot of research in the past, and he had very specific things that he wanted to find out about. Now, he was interested in certain documents and specific pieces of information, which would involve hours and hours and hours of microfilm and combing of family trees and things.
And very early on in the book, you write about wanting to mark these moments with your father. Was this sentiment part of why you wanted to take this trip with your dad?
I think I recognized he had been recently diagnosed with Parkinson's and was about to turn 80, and I recognized the precious nature of this time together. And so I was aware of that. In fact, that's why I wanted to go. I wanted to spend time with my dad, just the two of us, in a way that we never had before. On a trip to a foreign country by ourselves. And so I was aware of that, but I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. And it was one of those things that bubbled up in the moment.
One of the sweetest things in the book that I actually might borrow from you, which is, I'm just going to steal it from you, is you would mark these special moments about your dad. He would do something and then you would write it down. What are some of the things that you wrote, and why were you taking note of them?
It started in the airport. So in Dublin airport, when we arrived, he was giggling. We'd lost each other, and then we found each other, and he giggled like mad. And then he scurried off to the bathroom, and that was the moment when I thought, right, I'm just going to make a list. I'm going to flip to the back of my journal and make a list called Things About Dad. And I started it with how often he giggles. And then as I watched him scurrying back, I added the way he scurries. And it was things like that, just these fun, random, but quirky things that make him who he is.
Is part of it the fact that you see your dad, he has an illness and he's becoming older? Was that a part of it?
It was partly that. I think it was partly that, knowing that some of these things, the scurrying, for example, that's not something that people with advanced Parkinson's tend to do. So I was aware of that, but I wasn't marking it any sort of morbid way. I was just thinking, how fun would it be to just sketch him? I sketch with words. Other people bring, pen and ink drawings, or they do watercolors, but I do it with words. So that's what I was doing.
We would later find out that your dad and yourself have the same hair. How are you and your father different, and in what ways are you similar?
We both speak with our hands. We're both a bit, I think we try to take the sort of quickest path to joy. I learned that probably from both my parents.
What do you mean by that?
Well, my dad is someone, and I really admire this in him. It was one of the things I added to my list, that he received something like the diagnosis of Parkinson's, and it's not denial, but he just then tries to find the quickest way to joy, something that will be uplifting, something that will make him happy, that will contribute to the happiness of others, whatever it is. But there's very little stewing that goes on with my father, and I love that. The ways that we are different, maybe one of the ways that became apparent in the course of this book and the time together was the way that we look for story, the way that we look for truth, the way that we look, in fact, for identity. So, for example, my father was interested in documents and facts, and he wanted marriage deeds and, birth certificates. It's not that he's against story, but I really couldn't care less about those things. And I was interested in, the stories of these people and people in that area of that time. I wasn't actually that concerned about whether or not we were blood relation. And I really thought, who even knows whether these documents are true? No, we take them as fact, and, we take them as proof of something. But in fact, they are only story. When I see a document, a birth certificate with a father's name on it, well, we all know the mother has chosen to put that name on, or chosen to, assign the paternity of her child to that person. But unless there's a DNA test, which of course there wasn't in those days, no one really knows. So we're holding these documents up as facts, and we're trying to, make these clear lineages and so on, where I think, well, it's all fiction of one kind or another. Really, it's only as much truth as the age and the church allowed.
Why do you think that we take these things as facts?
Well, we like that because it's solid. We don't like uncertainty, I think, especially Western cultures who have this belief in that sort of, well, that's what we call history. What I find interesting is in other cultures, Aboriginal cultures, oral cultures, there's a greater overlap and acceptance of myth as being rooted actually in something higher than fact, which is truth. I mean, those two things are cousins, but they're not interchangeable. And certainly one points to the other, and they're both equally important, but they are not synonymous. And so that I find interesting, and I really resonate with that. In Mexico, for example, where I lived for the better part of a decade, myth and history are so interwoven that they are referred to, historians refer to myths as being holders of truth.
Well, part of this story about your dad's journey with you, it's also the history of Ireland. And you find out about the history of Ireland mostly through the people there. Did you find out anything that surprised you?
I did many things. I was unaware. I was unaware of the plight of most of the Irish people who left the island to come to Canada. Now, that might seem naive, and it is. I mean, there's no excuse for that. I wasn't aware. We all know about the famine, the Great Potato Famine, but I wasn't aware that, prior to that, it was a series of famines. I mean, the scale of misery and destitution in Ireland was unparalleled in the rest of Europe. I don't think I was aware of it to that degree. And then I didn't know the story. You mentioned my hair. I didn't know the story of the Spanish Armada. Do you want me to tell that, or
yes, please? Yes, please. Yeah.
Version? Okay. So one of the librarians, in the many times when I was bored and looking for something to amuse me,
and avoiding the files.
Yeah. So I would chat up the librarians, the security guards, people in the elevator, whatever it was. I was just looking for story, looking for conversation. I was interested. I loved the language. I was all constantly writing down people's expressions and things like that. And so one of these security guards said to me, "Well, I knew you were an Irish girl the moment you walked in here." And I said, "Well, hardly. This doesn't scream Irish to me." And he said, but if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'd be delighted to apprise you of a chapter of Irish history, which will link your hair directly to the shipwrecks of the Spanish Armada. Well, he had me there. I mean, I live for sentences like that. And so he told me about the Spanish Armada. I mean, I'll make it quick, but So they went up and they were attempting to invade England. And then there was a big battle in the Channel, and they sustained heavy damage. Their ships sustained heavy damage. And then they beat a hasty retreat up the North Sea, across over the Hebrides, Orkneys, and down the west coast of Ireland, retreating to Spain. But they cut too close to the rocky shores of Ireland. And most of the ships got washed up and crashed against these rocks, and the men perished. But for a 2-mile stretch of sandy strand in County Sligo, where my people are from. And as it turns out, the crew of those ships washed safely to shore on the gentle sand, and people in that part of Ireland have this kind of hair.
Does that mean that I'm also? Well, actually, my grandfather is Scottish. But I love that story, and that explains, because you said that you spent some time in Mexico, and when you heard that story, it kind of affirmed what you already had a connection to?
Well, I mean, this was really a leap of, I don't know if it's logic, but a leap of fantasy where I thought, well, that explains it. I've always loved all things Spanish. Learning Spanish is like finding a glove and slipping it on effortlessly. This is as much proof as I need. So I went scurrying over to my dad, because I also scurry, and I went scurrying over to my dad and said, Dad, I just found something incredible that finally explains, because my dad has this hair, but he keeps it very short. That explains this hair at last, because it's been a mystery in the family. And so I told him this story, and he said, well, there's no proof of that. There are no documents, there are no birth certificates. And
but does that kind of, because what you were saying before, so many of us, I think it's 26 million of us have given our DNA to different companies to trying to figure out where we're from. And your father is determined to find out who his ancestors are. And you can't really square why he's so interested in it. Why does your dad's passion make you so uneasy?
It's not that it makes me uneasy at all. I mean, I actually came to an acceptance of it, because what I realized is this is his passion, and we don't always understand the passions of others. But the only thing we have to understand is that they're passionate. No, we just have to admire that they are lit up by something. I mean, how beautiful. Isn't that what life is about? No, finding that. Mm-hmm. And so for some people it's birds. For my father's partner, it's opera. And for my dad, one of the things, he has many, one of the things is genealogy. I mean, he gets such a kick out of it. And so that's it. All I have to do is sit in the presence of that and be uplifted by that. What I just found puzzling, I mean, there were so many things I found puzzling. I just kept asking myself, who cares? Who cares? Because I realized I really don't care who my great grandfather's brothers, the nephew was. I don't care. And so what does that information give you? Does it give us anything? And is it possible to rely too much on that? Some people are looking for, they want to be descended from Cleopatra or the Queen or whatever it is. Well, not descended from the Queen, but related.
I'm like, you should be somewhere else with a crown somewhere. Anyway.
But that's not what my dad was doing. He's not looking for, famous grand people. It's an effort to understand who he is. And in fact, that quest is an extremely noble one. And I think we all have it, and it's primal. We want to know who we are and where we're from and where we belong. That call of belonging, which, if you grew up on the land of your ancestors, you have more naturally. But those of us, in the book, I say so many of us are cultural tumbleweeds. No, we have been uprooted from the land that sang us into existence, or would have sung our ancestors into existence. And so we've been cut off from something absolutely vital and crucial to the understanding of who we are. And we connect with that in different ways. And some people do it through story and song, and others do it through genealogy and documents and ancestry. And I'm game for all of it. It's more, the fun of writing the book. I played with that conceit, that he's interested in this and that bores me stiff, and he's not interested in story and I am. There was a certain degree of overlap. Mm-hmm. The thing about those sites, though, is that they're actually not, from my understanding, they're not as accurate as they're billed to be. It's not as though you spit in the tube and then you find out, oh, here's my family tree. No, they line you up with people who have similar DNA, who have also spit in the tube, for example. I mean, that's one of the many things. So of course you're going to find far more matches to people in countries where this is all the rage. And well, there are numerous problems, but that's one of them. So DNA isn't the answer.
One of the things, I think sometimes when we go on these quests of our own to find out where we're from, we assume it's going to be all good things. But what happens if it's something that can rock you to the core? You discovered your maternal great-grandfather had a tie to a Canadian residential school. How much of our identity should be derived from our ancestry, even if that history can be shameful?
Yeah, that was a shocking revelation, discovery that I made actually a year after the trip, because I was writing the book and I was doing research. I started doing some digging around on my own, and I found that connection, which initially I felt as though I just caught on fire. I mean, it was the most horrifying thing to discover. And it was a bit like discovering you had an ancestor who was in the SS or something. I mean, it was horrific. And initially, of course, I just wanted to bury it. And I thought, well, no one else has to know. That was my first instinct. Well, within a few minutes, I realized, okay, that's base. That's cowardly. Actually, what I need to do, I went for a long walk along the ocean. I was living in Vancouver at the time. And by the end of the walk, I'd realized, no, actually, the thing to do, the responsible thing here, is to stand up in that and to say, this is where I am from. This is my part of this story. And to take responsibility for that. And then do the things that one does when one tries to be responsible, when has that aim, starting with listen.
But
educate yourself.
I think that's a really, not to interrupt you, but I think that's, it's hard for a lot of people to come to that point, because you hear people saying, well, it wasn't me that did it, it was my ancestors, I wasn't around. How did you get to that point where you did have that viewpoint of, I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn?
You do hear that a lot, that, well, it wasn't me, it was my ancestors. And that to me misses the mark, really. It's not about assigning blame. No one is going to be punished. It's not, I think that's the wrong, it's the wrong model, really. I feel it's about standing up. The responsibility part is from here forward. So if I'm going to be a citizen of this country, knowing what I do, and all of us who have, particularly European immigrant backgrounds from that era, we all have some of this in our history. And so, but it's not about now we have to feel, terminal guilt and shame and so on. Those are negative emotions, which, well, we pass through those. But I think it's important to sit in that and then move to the other side of that, which is what now? What now? So this, if I have this knowledge, if I am aware of this, how does that make me feel in relation to the person I see sitting on the street now with, well, for example, when I was in Vancouver, the next time I went through East Vancouver and saw many of the Indigenous people who are in East Vancouver on the street, I am part of that story. That is not a separate story. Now, I've always felt a part of it in a way, but I felt it in the most visceral way. And that has not changed. And it has inspired me to read Indigenous writers, go to Indigenous theater, see Indigenous dance, and listen, be willing to change how I have believed a certain story, the history of Canada, to be, my part in it, my family's part, and most of all, acknowledge the privilege that I now sit in and where that came from.
You wonder, because in the book, I thought it was so refreshing that you admitted that your family benefited from the land that was the Indigenous people were displaced from, and how you're taking that responsibility very seriously.
Yeah. And it changes how, ideally, it changes the relationship we do have with land.
You wonder if your dad's obsession with ancestry is to fill the void of what he lost when he came out and divorced your mom, because his siblings ended up turning their backs on him and cutting him off. Were you able to find out more about that on this trip with your father?
It was a theory I had, and I asked him about it. So my dad came out of the closet in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was disowned by his whole family, except my mom and the kids. My brothers and I did not. We continued to have a relationship with him, but he did lose every bit of a family structure that he had had. And so I did wonder at one point, when I was sitting watching him in one of these pubs, conversing with a third cousin 6 times removed or whatever it was, looking for some connection. I did wonder, is this his attempt to reconstitute something that was taken from him, that he lost? I asked him, and he was curious about that question, but he never, I don't think, it's not a question that we process here. No, whatever is driving him is something far deeper than that. So I don't know the answer to it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's part of it.
There's also an urgency to find this information while you're on your trip. You write, no one knows what the future will hold, but we do know one thing. This is my dad's last trip to Ireland. How did you make peace with that?
By loving him, by being present. When we were together, even though I was distracting myself, of course, when I was meant to be looking at documents, but when we were together, the two of us, sitting across from each other at a pub at the end of the day, or having breakfast together in what would otherwise be a normal moment, even as we passed each other in the hallway, one of us going to the bathroom and the other leaving or something, I tried to be there, to be fully present to that, because what happens in the most ordinary moments, when we are fully present, when we bring the fullness of ourselves, when we're not anywhere else, something quite transcendent opens, and it can change an ordinary moment into something almost sacred.
I want to read something that you write in the book. You write beautifully, by the way, so hopefully my interpretation doesn't ruin it. You write, it never occurred to me before now that my rejection of my British heritage, this lineage, this ancestry, might have felt to my dad like a rejection of him. All those years I spent trying to win his approval, was I actually the one withholding my approval of him? His family and roots, our shared heritage. That is a gut punch. How did you feel when you made that realization?
Like I'd been punched in the gut. Yeah. Exactly that. Like so many children, I think I had been trying to please my father or impress him at different points in my life, and I always felt that it was that way. And there was a moment in that trip together that I realized, God, I'm 50 years old and I'm still doing this. I'm still trying to win his approval or something, and I really felt that that was something that he was responsible for. And something, it was, again, I think because I was willing, because it was just being together. That trip was really just about who we were to each other. It was in that sort of moment when you have the revelation, such as I had, where I realized, wait a minute, I've been rejecting him. Mm-hmm. In all of the bad mouthing that I've done my whole life about, British this and British that, and he studied at Oxford and I never took it seriously, and all these things. It never occurred to me that he had, in fact, probably longed to just be loved as he was too.
Isn't it a trip that we look at our parents like, one, we owned them, they're our parents, and we forget that they were people before they had us? And that realization kind of just, I think it makes things very clear, more clear.
Mm-hmm. And that it can affect the way that we see ourselves as parents and how our children see us too.
Especially when we have our own kids, and then you're like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, Dad and Mom, for being that kid.
That's right.
You're right. The only people who believe in history are those who are well represented by it. What did you mean by that?
Well, anyone who, I cannot imagine being an Indigenous person in Canada, well, any country, and reading what I was fed anyway as a student in the Canadian school system, and thinking, this is history? This is not history. This is a fiction. This is a colonial fiction that we are, that we're feeding our students so that they will, feel a sense of belonging to the fictional reality that we're creating, which avoids certain atrocities, certain huge atrocities. And so I can only imagine. Well, I can't imagine, but I suspect that there's not the same faith in history when you see it being so abused with facts, replete with facts, but also with, these great omissions. Now, as a woman, I guess I can say I feel that too, where I'm very often, when presented with some great historical figure, left to wonder, I wonder who fed the children, and all of that, and that, when those people are not mentioned, or when it's, when some great male hero is lauded, as having done it all himself, as this lone wolf figure, I also think, well, yes, according to you.
Well, we only have 30 seconds left. I wish I could talk to you longer. But What did your dad think of the book?
He enjoys it now, but I think at first maybe it was a little bit, well, it's difficult to see a portrayal of yourself that's not entirely as you see yourself. And I think he prefers not to see himself as a tremulous man in his 80s, and that's who he is. But fortunately he's someone who understands that art isn't about flattery, it's about truth.
Alison, thank you so much. It's such a fantastic read, and something that...
Thank you so much.
And the timing of it, when we rethink of how we're treating our elders, this is a fantastic book. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate it as well.
And that's it for tonight's agenda in the summer. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. I will see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.